Hi, my name is Micah, and today I'll present Do As I Can, Not As I Say, Grounding Language in Robot Affordances, and my Q&A critic is Danny. So to start off, before I get into the nuts and bolts, let's first undergo a quick philosophical motivation behind this paper. So within the world of software engineering, there's this well-known phenomena of the gap between the world of the machine and the unpredictable, messy, real world. This gap isn't quite intuitive for humans as embodied individuals, as our senses are very well attuned to our surroundings. However, for a robot with a limited action and state space, this gap is quite pronounced, the gap between the real world and the machine. For large language models in particular, this gap is especially pronounced. For a large language model, if you're trying to connect it to a robot, for example, you can say, clean up this spill on the table. And it can suggest things such as, oh, you can get a mop and wipe it up, or you can pick up a sponge and then clean it. But it doesn't actually know what the robot is doing. There's a gap between the real world and the machine because the LLM is not grounded within the affordances or feasibility of given actions from a robot. And so to address this kind of gap, what this paper proposes is considering both the language and affordance of any given action a robot can do. So in the case of I spilled my drink, can you help as an input query, an LLM can gauge the semantic relevance. So it can go through the set of actions and essentially pick which actions are the most relevant to its task. And it can, from the robot end, it can use a value function to determine which actions are actually feasible that I can accomplish in this moment. And in this way, you bridge the gap between the real world and the machine. You can, through the SAFe-CAN framework, be able to determine the best possible actions that are relevant and also feasible by the machine. Now, here's how this works. The first step is obviously to receive an input query from a user. How would you put an apple on the table, for example? In the next step, you score the possible set of actions in this case, they had 511 actions. And you would score them based on relevance with an LLM. And these scores are just the raw logics. You would use sigmoid to put it in probability space. And in this third step, you would, from the robot perspective, get a list of value, get the value function for each of the given actions and find the actions that are most likely or most feasible given the current action and state space. From there, you can then select the best possible outcome by multiplying the probabilities between what's likely, what's very relevant according to the LLM and the most feasible action. And in this case, it selected find an apple. Now, this is a very iterative process. It starts by first selecting an action. And with this being now the full context, we continue again and again and again through the exact same workflow. Here's a high-level overview over the algorithm, but the basic idea is within the state space of all possible actions, we want to predict the action that maximizes the combined probability of the affordance and the instruction relevance or action relevance. Within the log likelihood space, we would be adding these probabilities instead of multiplying them. Now a quick overview of the data collection process. So to understand this, you must first understand behavior cloning. What it does is essentially bridges the world of supervised learning and reinforcement learning. If you're trying to teach a remote control car how to drive, and as a robot, it's really complicated because you know the position and velocity of the wheels, but you don't necessarily know how to tune them in order to avoid hitting obstacles. But through a data set of people actually driving the car on their own, the agent has a much better way of learning a baseline policy that can navigate its surroundings using supervised learning. Now, in stage one of the data collection process, the researchers used a joystick controller to control the robot, control the base of the robot, and they used a VR headset to track the motion of their hands to control the position of the gripper. And through the set of 11 months, they collected 68,000 episodes where each episode included RGB camera frames, proprioceptive states, action sequences, natural language labels for the skills. This was a huge overload for these researchers, but they basically amounted a huge behavior cloning data set, which they then used in steps 2 and 3, where they created 276,000 autonomous episodes, and from those episodes selected 12,000 that were sufficient to add to the training data. From then, they manually removed episodes that were unsafe, undesirable, or infeasible. This was the main architecture that they used, but the main idea is that they use an RGB camera input with the skill description input to learn the observation states. Now, in the final stage, after the behavior cloning process, they used some basic sparse reinforcement learning with rewards. They had 3 human raters, and they had to agree whether the skill succeeded or failed. If it succeeded with 2 out of 3 agreeing about that, then there would be a reward of 1 and otherwise a reward of 0. And the idea was that this reward was used to train a model with a multitask optimization-based policy. Now, this is a reward-based policy or a value-based function policy. And I'm not going to get into the nuts and bolts of it here, but the main takeaway is you can use this framework to have a single model, but learn the value function for many different tasks at once. And the idea behind this is you simply condition behind the task itself. So you can have a natural language task as an input to the model. So rather than having, for example, one model for picking up an apple and another model for picking up a sponge, in this case, now you can have one model that accomplishes all of this by simply feeding the natural language action in as an input. This is the network architecture for the RL policy. And a easy way to understand this is the inputs are the action and state space with the LLM or with the action skill description. And this conditional target Q function, you can think of it like the 1 or the 0, which the reviewers gave to the whether it was a success or fail of the skill. This conditional Q function is essentially the value learned or how feasible the action is given the state action and the skill description. So now onto the results. I'm not going to go heavy into this, but we're going to focus on the PaLM results since this language model did better. And one of the main results was that they produced this visualization of sequential decision-making of the model along with the language and affordance scores. And it's really cool to see how the model logically selected the next action based on instruction relevance and affordance. They tested many different instruction families for the robot, and this makes sense since they wanted to basically see the many different capabilities. But the one we'll focus on is long horizon, since this capability is the most difficult to do in the field of robotics. So they listed success rate by family. And the first thing we should pay attention to is how they also tested without the affordance function or without using an LLM. And as you can see, the results were much worse without any affordance or LLM instruction. The next thing you should notice is that for simple tasks, the model did really well. And this makes sense as in general, these tasks are already very feasible within the field of robotics. However, the most surprising result is that with their 47% accuracy for execution. In the field of robotics, this is insane. For example, if you have this input that's, I spilled my Coke on the table, throw it away and bring me something to clean. I feel like if you asked 100 humans that, not 100 humans would get that right. Like, especially on a really bad day, they may not even hear you correctly or something. So the fact that a robot could achieve a 40% accuracy on such a complex task is incredible. And I feel like this really shows how far the SEIKAN framework takes the field of robotics. And just to contextualize this too, their overall results were really high as well, which just shows how robust the SEIKAN framework is in grounding LLMs in the real world, especially as connected to an embodied agent. Now, there were some key limitations of the paper. One, the agents didn't really know when it failed. So, for example, if it was to pick up a sponge in its set of instructions, it wouldn't actually know if it picked up the sponge or not after it moves on to the next instruction, which is a huge bottleneck for success. And the second main limitation is 2 environments were used, which I thought was crazy at first, but now I'm thinking that the researchers were really aiming to just show that their methodology was feasible. And I think they were totally okay with only having 2 environments because yes, while there is overfitting, at least they're not aiming to show that their methodology is robust, but instead that the methodology works in the first place. The final main limitation is the methodology is not that accessible. While they do provide an open source framework for this project, what they really miss out on is being able to allow people to really try this for themselves in its full capacity. I mean, they spent 11 months collecting that data, and it's a shame that it's really hard to replicate this methodology. So here are the main questions I got from Danny. I got 3 questions from her. I'll go through them sequentially. So the first question is, in the future, how will the robot learn to do a combination of actions? So I would argue that this is actually already the case. As of right now, the robot is sequentially doing for the long horizon tasks, they are for sure doing many actions in a row. But I would say if the question is asking like, how would the robot learn how to do a combination of actions within a single pass? I would say that this is probably against the philosophy of the paper. Like, I think the intention of the authors was for an agent to do a bunch of simple modular instructions over a period of time rather than to do everything at once, because I think this would cause an agent to more likely fail for long horizon tasks. I think in the field of robotics, generally robots achieve very high success with simple tasks. So I think by making the robot do a combination of actions, that would make their framework less successful. Now, underfitting and overfitting. So I was also asked, how did the authors address underfitting and or overfitting in the data collection process from the human operators? So I will say that they are definitely overfitting, at least in the behavior cloning process from the human operators data. But this is definitely a planned thing, because in the real world, it's extremely hard for a robot to learn with pure reinforcement learning policies as complex as picking up an apple and bringing me a sponge or something like that. So what's really amazing, what the researchers do actually is not really prioritize robustness necessarily, but they really want to show that the SEICAN framework is feasible. And so yes, they are overfitting in terms of the behavior cloning process. However, I will say that they do mitigate this through the multitask op-based policy. The idea is essentially, even if they are overfitting in their training data to many different tasks, the idea of further reinforcement learning from the behavior cloning itself will essentially automatically diversify the policies of the agent. My reasoning for this is because environments are inherently messy. Even within the two environments they had, those kitchens were extremely disorganized, and there were a lot of different things that could complicate the process along the way, like a different position of the apple or different height of the chair or table. And so through having an empty opt-based policy, even if we overfit during the behavior cloning stage, it's not a major problem, because at the end of the day, the robot will then learn further a policy that is robust within the kitchen environment. And outside of the kitchen environments, the researchers aren't that worried about it, because again, their goal isn't to necessarily show robustness with many environments, but to show that their framework works. So the final question I got asked was, how has this particular research area evolved since the paper was released? And actually, I love this question because I got to learn more about the state of the art in the field of robotics. And I found out that the SEICAN framework has been superseded. I learned that, well, so just for some background, large language models, like the one that they use in the framework, they use a token as an input and like a natural language token as an input, and produce a natural language token as an output. Then there are VLMs, or vision language models, which take not only natural language tokens, but also vision tokens, and they can produce an output from there. But then there are VLAs, which are visual language action models, and they're capable of taking not only the natural language as a token, the vision as a token, but also the actuator action itself as a token. And what's incredible about this, the idea of robotics transformers, which has only become relevant within the last 2-3 years, is they're essentially capable of taking the robot state itself and producing a resulting action on the end of the robot. And what's so fascinating about this is what the SEICAN framework does is they are fragmentizing the language and the affordance, and they're basically treating this whole process as something very modular and discrete, with many different steps that fit together in order to get a long horizon action to be successful for the robot. But robotics transformers, they do this all implicitly on the basis of the architecture. And through a simple natural language query, a robotics transformer is now capable of long horizon planning and action without needing to explicitly connect the language and affordance, as this is implicitly part of the architecture. And this has led to groundbreaking results, which shatter the SEICAN frameworks, what they were able to achieve. And robotics transformers also outperform SEICAN in long horizon tasks too. So the state of the art is honestly incredible as of now. These are my references and citations. Thank you so much. I hope you have a great day.